The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1, Titus Groan. And horses took them home. As Fuchsia recognized the head of Steerpike, the rod fell from her outstretched arm. Her weakened hand loosed its grasp upon the shelf, and she fell backwards into space. The dark hair of her head reaching below her as she fell, her body curving backwards as though she had been struck. The doctor and Flay, leaping forward, half caught her. A moment later, and the glass above them came splintering into the room, and Steerpike's voice from overhead cried, "Hold your horses! I'm letting down a ladder! Don't panic there! Don't panic!" Every eye was turned from Fuchsia to the window, but Prunesqualor, as he had heard the glass break above him, had shielded the girl by swinging her behind him. It had fallen all about them, one large piece skimming the doctor's head and splintering on the floor at his feet. The only one to sustain any injury was Flay, who had a small piece of flesh nicked from his wrist. "Hang on there!" continued Steerpike in an emanated voice, which sounded singularly unrehearsed. "Don't stand so near! I'm going to crack some more glass out!" The company below the window drew back and watched him strike off the jagged corners of glass from the sides of the window with a piece of flint. The room behind them was now well ablaze, and the sweat was pouring from their upturned faces, their clothes scorched dangerously, and their flesh smarting with the intense heat. Steerpike, on the outside of the wall, standing on the short, protruding branches of the pine ladder, began to struggle with the other length of pine which he had propped beside him. This was no easy job, and the muscles of his arms and back were strained almost to breaking point as he levered the long pole upwards and over his shoulder by degrees, keeping his balance all the while with the greatest difficulty. As well as he could judge, the library ought by now to be in perfect condition for a really theatrical piece of rescue work. Slowly but surely, he edged and eased the pole across his shoulder and through the broken window. It was not only a heavy and dangerous feat, standing as he was, balanced upon the stubby 6-inch offshoots of pine and hauling the resinous thing over his shoulder, but what added to his difficulty was these lateral stubs themselves, which caught in his clothes and on the window ledge at each attempt he made to slide the long monster through the opening and down into the bright library. At last, both difficulties were overcome, and the gathering on the inner side of the wall below the window found the 15-foot bole of a pine edging its way through the smoky air above them, swaying over their heads and then landing with a crash at their feet. Steerpike had held fast to the upper end of the pole, and it would have been possible for one of the lighter members of the party to have climbed it at once, but Prunesqualor moved the base of the tree a little to the left and swiveled it until the most powerful of the stubby lateral rungs were more conveniently situated. Steerpike's head and shoulders now appeared fully in view through the broken window. He peered into the crimson smoke. "Nice work," he said to himself, and then shouted, "Glad I found you! I'm just coming!" Nothing could have gone more deliciously according to plan. But there was no time to waste, no time to crow. He could see that the floorboards had caught, and there was a snake of fire slithering its way beneath the table. Steerpike lifted his voice. "The heir of Gormenghast!" he shouted. "Where is Lord Titus? Where is Lord Titus?" Prunesqualor had already reached Mrs. Slag, who had collapsed over the child, and he lifted them both together in his arms and ran swiftly back to the ladder. The Countess was there. They were all there at the foot of the pine, all except Sourdust, whose sacking had begun to smoulder. Fuchsia had dragged Irma across the floor by her heels, and she lay as though she had been washed ashore by a tempest. Steerpike had crawled through the window and was a third of the way down the bowl. Prunesqualler, climbing to the third rung, was able to pass Titus to the youth, who retreated through the window backwards and was down the outer ladder in a flash. He left the infant among the ferns under the library wall and swarmed up the ladder for the old nurse. The tiny, limp midget was almost as easy to deal with as Titus, and Prunesqualler passed her through the window as though he were handling a doll. Steerpike laid her next to Titus and was suddenly back at the window. It was obvious that Irma was the next on the list, but it was with her that the difficulties began. The moment she was touched, she began to thrash about with her arms and legs. 30 years of repression were finding vent. She was no longer a lady. She could never be a lady again. Her pure white feet were indeed composed of clay, and now, with all the advantages of a long throat, she renewed her screaming. But it was weaker than before, for the smoke which had coiled around her vocal cords had taken their edge away, and they were now more in the nature of wool than gut. Something had to be done with her, and quickly. Steerpike swarmed down the top half of the pole and dropped to the library floor. Then, at his suggestion, he and the doctor began to strip away lengths of her dress with which they bound her arms and legs, stuffing the remainder in her mouth. Together, with the help of Flay and Fuchsia, they heaved the writhing Irma by degrees up the ladder, until Steerpike, climbing through the window, was able to drag her through into the night air. Once through, she was treated with still less decorum, and her descent of the wall was abrupt, the boy with the high shoulders merely seeing to it that she should not break more bones than was necessary. In point of fact, she broke none, her peerless flesh sustaining only a few purple bruises. Steerpike had now 3 figures in a row among the cold ferns. While he was swarming back, Fuchsia was saying, "No, I don't want to. You go now. Please, you go now."
"Silence, you child," answered the Countess. "Don't waste time. As I tell you, girl, as I tell you, at once."
"No, mother, no."
"Fuchsia, dear,"
said Prunesqualler, "you will be out in a brace of shakes and ladders. It will save time, Gypsy. Hurry now. Don't stand there gawping, girl."
Fuchsia glanced at the doctor. How unlike himself he looked, the sweat pouring from his forehead and running between his eyes.
"Up you go, said Prunesqualler.
Fuchsia turned to the ladder, and after missing her foothold once or twice, disappeared above them.
"Good girl," shouted the doctor. "Find your nanny slag. Now then, your ladyship, up you go."
The Countess began to climb, and although the sound of the wooden stubs being broken on either side of the pole accompanied her, yet her progress towards the window held a prodigious inevitability in every step she took and in every heave of her body. Like something far larger than life, her dark dress shot with the red of the fire, she ploughed her way upwards to the window. There was no one on the other side to help her, for Steerpike was in the library, and yet for all the contortions of her great frame, for all the ungainliness of her egress, a slow dignity pervaded her, which gave even to the penultimate view, that of her rear disappearing hugely into the night, a feeling rather of the awesome than the ludicrous. There remained only Lord Sepulchrave, Prunesqualler, Flay, and Steerpike. Prunesqualler and Steerpike turned to Sepulchrave quickly in order to motion him to follow his wife, but he had disappeared. There was not a moment to lose. The flames were crackling around them. Mixed with the smell of smoke was the smell of burning leather. There were few places which he could be unless he had walked into the flames. They found him in an alcove a few feet from the ladder, a recess still hidden to some extent from the enveloping heat. He was smoothing the backs of a set of the Metrovian dramatists, bounding gold fibre, and there was a smile upon his face that sent a sick pang through the bodies of the 3 who found him. Even Steerpike watched that smile uneasily from beneath his sandy eyebrows. Saliva was beginning to dribble from the corner of his lordship's sensitive mouth, and the corners curved upwards, and his teeth were bared. It was the smile one sees in the mouth of a dead animal when the loose lips are drawn back and the teeth are discovered curving towards the ears.
"Take them! Take your books, your lordship, and come quickly," said Steerpike fiercely. "Which do you want?"
Sepulchrave turned about sharply and with a superhuman effort forced his hands stiffly to his sides and walked at once to the pine ladder. "I am sorry to have kept you," he said, and began to climb swiftly. As he was lowering himself on the far side of the window, they heard him repeat as though to himself, "I am sorry to have kept you." And then there was a thin laugh like the laugh of a ghost. There was no longer any time for deciding who was to follow whom, no time for chivalry. The hot breath of the fire was upon them. The room was rising around them, and yet Steerpike managed to keep himself back. Directly Flay and the doctor had disappeared, he ran up the pine bole like a cat and sat astride the window ledge a moment before he descended on the far side. With the black autumn night behind him, he crouched there, a lurid carving, his eyes no longer black holes in his head, but glittering in the blood-red lights like garnets. "Nice work," he said to himself for the second time that night. "Very nice work." And then he swung his other leg over the high sill. "There is no one left!" he shouted down into the darkness.
"Sourdust!"
said Prunesqualler, his thin voice sounding singularly flat.
"Sourdust has been left!"
Steerpike slid down the pole. "Dead?" he queried.
"He is,"
said Prunesqualler. No one spoke. As Steerpike's eyes became accustomed to the darkness, he noticed that the earth surrounding the Countess was a dusky white, and that it was moving, and it was a few moments before he realized that white cats were interweaving about her feet. Fuchsia, directly her mother had followed her down the ladder, began to run, stumbling and falling over the roots of trees, and moaning with exhaustion as she staggered on. When, after an eternity, she had reached the main body of the castle, she made her way to the stables, and at last had found and ordered 3 grooms to saddle the horses and proceed to the library. Each groom led a horse by the side of the one he rode. On one of these, Fuchsia was seated, her body doubled forward. Broken by the shock, she was weeping, her tears threading their brackish paths over the coarse mane of her mount. By the time they had reached the library, the party had covered some distance of the return journey. Flay was carrying Irma over his shoulder. Prunesqualler had Mrs. Slag in his arms, and Titus was sharing the warbler's nest in the Countess's bosom. Steerpike, watching Lord Sepulchrave very closely, was guiding him in the wake of the others, deferentially holding his lordship's elbow. When the horses arrived, the procession had practically come to a standstill. The beasts were mounted, the grooms walking at their side, holding the bridles, and staring over their shoulders with wide, startled eyes at the raw patch of light that danced in the darkness like a pulsating wound between the straight black bones of the pine trees. During their slow progress, they were met by indistinguishable crowds of servants who stood on the side of the track in horrified silence. The fire had not been visible from the castle, for the roof had not fallen, and the only window was shielded by the trees, but the news had spread with Fuchsia's arrival. The night, which had so dreadful a birth, continued to heave and sweat until the slow dawn opened like an icy flower in the east and showed the smoking shell of Sepulchrave's only home. The shelves that still stood were wrinkled charcoal, and the books were standing side by side upon them, black, grey, and ash-white, the corpses of thought. In the centre of the room, The discoloured marble table still stood among a heap of charred timber and ashes, and upon the table was the skeleton of Sourdust. The flesh was gone with all its wrinkles. The coughing had ceased for ever.